Good evening, and thanks to coming to the first event of the Freedom Project this semester at Wellesley College. My name is Mustafa Akil, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Freedom Project. And we are honored tonight to have Dr. Alice Dreger as our speaker. Now, before inviting her, I want to say a few things about her career. She's coming from Michigan, East Lansing. She just came the other night. She's a prominent historian of medicine and science, and I must say she's a prolific journalist as well. She's an award-winning scholar and writer. She authored 4 books published by Harvard University Press or Penguin Books, and has been a recipient of a prestigious award by the Guggenheim Foundation. She has written articles in publications like New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, any prominent publication you can imagine. Her 2015 book, Galileo's Middle Finger, which I have a copy here, and I strongly recommend checking that, was praised by the New York Times as a smart, delightful, a splendidly entertaining education in ethics, activism, and science. The Chronicle of Higher Education calls her a star scholar, and I think that's pretty accurate. And the book has been reviewed all over, from New York Times to other prominent newspapers and magazines. Dr. Dreger's research on the nature of sex and intersex people has especially been significant. While the work has been highly respected as groundbreaking, it was sometimes unfairly accused, as we think. The facts she represented were criticized on the grounds of opinion, and sometimes just imaginary facts were made up and presented as if she said those. I'm sure she can explain more. In 2005, she resigned from her professorship position at Northwestern University over an effort by the administration to censor her academic article. And as a Freedom Project, we believe that culture, science will advance when we have paradigm questioning thinkers in every field. Thomas Kuhn, the questioning of scientific paradigms is really important. So we also believe in scientific research or new perspectives that really open new perspectives. And I think Dr. Dreger certainly has been one of those scholars. I look forward to hearing more about this in a minute. And before that, I want to have one more announcement. In the Freedom Project, we're planning for the future. We are certainly dedicated to the rights of our LGBTI friends and colleagues and sisters and brothers. Next semester, we'll have a few events highlighting the rights, the civil liberties of LGBTI community. We will have some prominent speakers. Chelsea Benning is one of those. She also has a very prominent, controversial political career as well. Another speaker we will have is David Leviathan, not Leviathan, but Leviathan, if I'm saying it right, whose award-nominated book, Two Boys Kissing, has been the most banned book in the United States in the past couple of years. Not banned by the government, as would happen in my country or something, but banned by librarians saying that this is not appropriate and so on and so forth. So we will hopefully have him as a speaker in our next semester at the Freedom Project as well. But tonight we are truly honored to have Dr. Alice Dreger as our speaker, a guest lecturer. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks for being here this evening. One of the great things about coming to the Freedom Project has been hanging out with scholars like Mustafa who come from truly repressive regimes, and it really lends wonderful perspective in terms of one's own work. People sometimes call the work that I do brave or courageous, but it's nothing like what people in some nations are facing in terms of murder of journalists, murder of scholars. I run a newspaper for East Lansing because we otherwise would have no factual news, and my reporters, I use citizen reporters, sometimes are afraid of pissing people off, but I try to remind them nobody is going to come arrest us for reports that we're doing. Nobody is going to try to murder us or our family members. So it's really a wonderful thing to have the perspective of those of you who are coming internationally and are here as scholars under some degree of protection temporarily, but it's very scary to think about what you face. So I asked faculty and students today what they wanted me to talk about, and the list they gave me was so fantastic, and it would take up about 3 days of your time, so I had to pick and choose. But I just wanted to say that I decided this evening to end with one student asked me in a course today, a course on freedom, and that was how can we do better activism? And I know a lot of you are really interested in doing effective activism, so I thought it would be great to end with my thoughts on that question. I thought about it even more after class today with regard to how can we do social justice work that is more effective and perhaps more just in its work. So I'd like to close with that later on. But first I wanted to address this issue of Koch brother funding for the Freedom Project. I was talking with some of the folks last night, and I think the tendency when you're getting money from a controversial source is to assure yourself that you remain independent. What I will tell you is that, in fact, much research shows very clearly that where our money comes from does influence us. We know this quite clearly from psychological studies, from neurological studies, and also from sociological studies, as well as some really excellent work that's been done in medicine, in medical ethics work, looking at, if you look at, for example, the results of a drug that are in the studies produced funded by the drug companies versus independent, not funded by the drug companies, it always skews in the direction of being better, a better drug when it's funded by drug companies. It's not random, it skews in that direction. So I think there's no question that where our funding comes ends up influencing us. And one of the things that bothers me as a person who's a progressive and a feminist is that issues of freedom, freedom of speech, academic freedom are becoming something that the right is funding and the left is not. And it seems to me urgent that the left recognize that this is an issue for us, that historically we have been the people who have been oppressed and endangered and fired and marginalized. And we need on the left to understand this as our issue. And if we forget where we came from in terms of our freedoms, we will forget that the reason I'm able to be a woman who has a PhD is because of women who were radicals who were subject to suppression of their speech, subject to arrest for attempting to agitate for the vote. That we have to recognize this as our issue historically and today and in the future. That the issue of freedom is not something we can leave to the right. It is something we have to care deeply about on the left. So I'm going to talk about that today and talk about how we got to where we are today. I have to say that sometimes people worry, you know, when there's protests at my talks or people are objecting to things that I'm going to be upset about this. I actually find it very exciting because to me it is a sign of success. It is a sign that the work tens of thousands of people have done to empower young people, to empower students, to empower people who are historically marginalized has worked. If it were not the case that people were objecting to speakers, including, I guess, people like myself, it would be a sign that we haven't succeeded. So to me, yes, some people misuse empowerment, some people misrepresent, but the fact that we have vigorous conversations where people can act up without fear of being shot or imprisoned is a sign that we're doing well. And it's a sign of, to my mind, definite success. I will just briefly note that Mustafa made a bit of a reference to this. And I'll talk a little more about this. One of the things that's happened to me is that people have created false accounts in my name. So there are Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts and blogs that have my photograph, that are really my photograph, and my name, but are not me. And this has been done in order to defame me, to mark me as an enemy of transgender people, specifically. And so a student, for example, read to me today something I supposedly said, and I had trouble not laughing because it's so the opposite of everything I believe. So one of the things I would encourage you is, as you approach things that you think somebody said, to try, if you can, figure out if that actually is what they said. Some of the sites have gone so far as to footnote things I never said, as if they are that real. And of course, most of us never bother to check a footnote. I often do not bother to check footnotes. So it can be very challenging in that way to figure out what is real and what is false. I actually had the experience where there was a Facebook account completely false in my name, written as if it were me. And Facebook, I found out, if you can get a human at Facebook, which is challenging, requires not the person with the false account to prove that they are you. They forced me to prove that I was me. So I had to send them a photograph of my passport page and my birth certificate, proving that I was me before they closed that page. And shortly after they closed that page, another one sprung up. And I decided pretty soon I couldn't spend my whole life trying to, slay my clones. It was not going to be possible. And so I gave up trying to do that. So I was actually hoping people who are protesting today would come in and talk about what they think I've said so that we could talk about that stuff. But I guess maybe that's not going to happen today. So I just want to talk some about how I got to this work in Galileo's middle finger today, and then help us think about what should we do in a situation where we feel very impassioned about social justice causes, as I do, but we also have a situation where sometimes there's clashes that lead to suppression of freedoms on the part of people who say things that are considered by social justice advocates dangerous or offensive. And I'll tell you that where I'm going to come down is not on a simple side that social justice activists are bad people and that researchers are good people, or vice versa. I'm very much in both camps, and I care very much about both. So it's very much a concern to me that we try to do the best work on both sides of that we possibly can. And the reason I think that's really important is because social justice that's effective needs research. It needs research because it needs to know what's true in the world in order to develop effective policy. You can't develop effective policy about rape or about intersex or about healthcare if you don't actually know what's true in terms of the way the world works. And at the same time, you can't have good research if you don't have a system of justice. So you can't have people doing good, well-done research if you have a system where they have to live in fear. So the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of justice are dependent upon each other, and they require each other to be healthy. It's not always going to be the case that they work seamlessly together, but it has to be the case that if we care about one, you have to care about the other. They can't live without each other. And the Founding Fathers really knew that when they set up the First Amendment as they did, which was very much caring about issues of free inquiry and free speech. Okay, so where did my work come from? In terms of my academic work, I came to the topic of intersex because I was interested in feminism and science. And my dissertation director, I had two dissertation directors, one of them suggested to me that I should look at the history of what was in the 19th century labeled hermaphroditism. And the reason he thought this would be interesting is because nobody had done a historical study of it. And I thought I would look at Darwin's barnacles, and I would look at history of embryology, and he kept saying to me, no, look at medicine. And I thought, why would I look at medicine? This doesn't happen in humans past the embryological stage, because I had never heard of it. And once he and another professor convinced me to look at medicine, I went to the original Medline, or PubMed, which was this thing called the Index Catalog of the Library of the Surgeon General of the United States from the 19th century, and opened it up. So these were this was an index of medical texts from the 1800s. Opened it up to the section on hermaphroditism. And there were hundreds upon hundreds of case studies of people who had come to physicians' offices documented as having various types of sex differences. And I was absolutely stunned. I thought, how could I be as advanced as I am in my life, a feminist, somebody who cares about women's health, somebody who's sexually active, and have never heard of this? So I became very interested to understand how it could be that this was basically suppressed knowledge within an advanced civilization. That was a civilization that had gone through a sexual revolution, that had gone through a women's health movement. This was in the 1990s. So I set out to study what had happened to the people who doctors labeled hermaphrodites in the late 1800s and early 1900s in France and Britain. And I started documenting what had happened to them. And the bottom line of what had happened to them was that doctors were trying desperately to organize them in a way that they could make sense of them in a two-sex system. The reason being, politically, doctors were conservative, and they didn't want a situation where there was biological confusion, because that could lead to social confusion. And they didn't want social confusion. They didn't want women to have the right to vote. They didn't want homosexuality recognized as a normal form of sexuality. They wanted a clear sex division. So as I began publishing the work, publishing the photographs I had found and the drawings I had found, and publishing the stories of these people and what had happened to them, the intersex rights movement had started a few years earlier. And so the people in that movement who had been born with the same types of conditions I was looking at from the 19th century started to contact me through the internet, which was a relatively new thing. And one of them, the founder of the Intersex Society of North America, Beau Laurent, who went by the activist named Cheryl Chase at the time, asked me to help change the current day medical system. And I said to her, I do dead people, I don't do living people, I'm a historian. But she said, but you consider yourself a feminist, I know from your work, so why don't you just look at what's going on today? And that was easy for me to do because I was shacking up with a medical student. So he had modern books on one side of the room and I had old books on the other side of the room. He is still my partner today. He's now a physician and a medical educator. So I went and looked at his books. This was in about 1994. This is not the Dark Ages. This is about the time of Will and Grace coming onto television. So people had heard of gay people. And what his textbook, these were expensive medical modern textbooks, said. I opened first to the section on clitoromegaly, which is the medical term for when a girl's clitoris is large and it may peek out from beyond the labia so it's visible. And what this textbook said was that if a girl was born with clitoromegaly, she might grow up to be a lesbian, so you should cut down her clitoris so that it didn't happen. And I was absolutely stunned. First of all, I had no idea why they would assume that a large clitoris would somehow lead to lesbianism and that cutting it down would prevent this, and that lesbianism was a bad medical outcome in 1994. So then I opened to the section on what's called hypospadias, which is when the urinary opening of the penis isn't on the end of the penis, but is on the side or sometimes down near the scrotum. And what it said was that, this was a medical textbook, if you could not write your name in the snow next to other little boys, you might grow up to be gay. So you had to do a surgery for purely psychosocial reasons to move the urinary opening, which is actually a pretty complicated surgery that has a lot of risk associated. So my partner came home from the clinics and I said to him, I showed him this stuff and I said, did you write your name in the snow next to other little boys? And he said, no, do you think I'm gay? I was like, what is this in this modern textbook, right? So I thought I would help the intersex rights movement and I thought it would take about 6 months. They were actively lying to patients, which in no other field of medicine was sanctioned as the ethical thing to do. They were removing healthy reproductive tissue from babies before they could consent out of the idea that everybody had to be sex normalized. So taking away people's ability to later reproduce. They were actively doing genital surgeries that were optional in order to sex normalize children according to a system without any evidence that this was necessary, safe, or effective. So I thought it would be pretty easy to update the system, but I was wrong, and 20 years later we are still not that far into the reform system. But I became part of the intersex rights movement because it seemed so clear to me that the doctors' intentions were good, but that they had no data to back up what they were doing, and that the anecdotal data I was hearing, namely from people who had grown up through this system, was that this was really, really harmful. And in fact, to this day, 30 years now into the intersex rights movement, we have never had a single intersex person come out and say they are glad that that is the way they had been treated. Not a single human being has challenged the intersex rights movement to say, this happened to me as a baby and I'm glad my parents and my doctors made this decision. So what that suggests to me is that a lot of people were harmed, and also a lot of people may simply not know what happened to them. People were lied to when they grew up. They were told things like you had hernia surgery or you had twisted ovaries when in fact they were born with testes. So about 10 years into this work, I was kind of exhausted and burned out, and I had left my tenure job at Michigan State and was moving to Northwestern to take on a part-time job because I was simultaneously doing mainstream writing and raising a kid and also doing patient advocacy work. And I ended up, through a mutual friend, through Paul Vasey, meeting Michael Bailey, who is a sex researcher at Northwestern University. And he had been caught a few years earlier in a great controversy over a book that he'd written called The Man Who Would Be Queen, which was interested in what he called feminine males. These were boys who were kind of feminine in terms of their behaviors and interests, or men who transitioned later in life because they identified as women. And so, I explain in the book how this came to be, but I ended up looking into the Bailey book controversy because I had actually known people on both sides of this controversy, and it appeared that what I had heard about it didn't seem to be correct. And as a historian, this is something very interesting to me, because as a historian, whenever you come across something where you think you knew something, but it turns out to be not what you knew, it's very interesting. That's how I came initially into the intersex work, was for that very reason, that it seemed like what I had been told was not accurate. So what Bailey had been supporting in the book that had been controversial was a theory put forward by Ray Blanchard, a sex researcher in Canada. And it was the idea that among people who transition from men to women, that they come in two types, two basic demographic categories, and that in both cases, it wasn't simply about gender identity, but it was also about sexual orientation. And so for some who grew up being identified as pretty feminine in their behaviors and interests, they were attracted to men when they grew up, and that was one category. And that's actually a category that we actually see cross-culturally in traditional cultures. It's a form of transgenderism that involves a sort of cultural category where people are switched over in order to sort of make sense within the cultural systems of their sexuality. So the other type that Bailey and Blanchard talked about was the controversial type, and that was something that Blanchard called autogynephilia, which was the idea that for these folks, they had not had extremely feminine childhoods or feminine interests in terms of the way that they had been identified culturally, but that they felt themselves to have a feminine component, and that part of that was a gendered component that felt sexually aroused by the idea of being or becoming women. So the word autogynephilia, when you break down, is self, gyne is female, and philia, love of oneself as a woman. In the French, there's a French term for it, amour de soi en femme, love of oneself as a woman, which is a much more beautiful and elegant way to think about it. And what Bailey and Blanchard were suggesting was that gender is not totally separate from sexuality. That in fact, gender and sexual orientation are connected for people, including for some transgender people. I actually don't, 20 years into this, I don't find that, or I guess for me, 15 years into it, I don't find that radical an idea. That in fact, I think for many of us, although we've been told gender and sexual orientation are separate, that for many of us they interact, and that's no different for this population. But this was a very controversial idea to put out there. And what had happened to Bailey was that he had been attacked by a group of transgender activists. When I set out to look at the history of what had happened with Bailey's book and the controversy around it, I really thought I was going to end up with a he said, she said controversy, where he was going to be, and he is, a white man, straight, able-bodied, impolitic clod in many ways. And that what was going to happen was that the transgender activists would be well-meaning but simply misunderstood what he said, or that they would find offensive what he said. That's sort of he said, she said sort of thing. But I ended up digging into this work and spending unexpectedly a year of research on it, and interviewed about 100 people, looked at about 1,000 sources, and it became a very intense investigative journalism project, essentially. And what I found was that, in fact, the charges made against Bailey, which were very serious, were not only not true, but the people who had made them would have known that they were not true. So there were things like that he had done human subjects research without institutional review board oversight, so ethics board oversight, that he had faked research and data, that he had had sex with a transgender woman when she was his research subject, and that he had been practicing clinical psychology without a license. All of these things could have been potentially career-wrecking. In addition to this, a few of them also went much more vicious. They went after his children, putting up pictures that they had taken from his website of his children online with captions suggesting that their father had sodomized them. This was meant to be a parody of some lines out of his book, but it was pretty intense stuff. They went after his family, after his colleagues. A couple of them were regularly calling his colleagues, telling them that they should have him basically be fired, that he was a drunk, that he was a pervert, that he should not be around the university system. They had filed formal charges with Northwestern's administration in terms of ethics charges. There was an investigation at Northwestern. They filed complaints against him with the Illinois Board of Professional Psychology, so he was investigated by that board. On and on and on it went. And so when it came time for me to publish my findings in this case, which was basically that he had been set up because he had put forth an idea that was politically offensive, I recognized that these people were likely to come after me. That what they had done to him wasn't going to be limited to him, because they had also gone after anybody who had aligned themselves with him. So my choice was either to ditch it all and forget about it and not publish it, or to publish it. And I felt I had to publish it because 100 people had helped me by doing interviews with me, and I had spent a year of my life on this, and I did not feel that I could be cowardly. I did not feel that I could do all of that work and know what I knew and not say what I knew. And it was difficult to face this because I recognized that in doing this, this was probably going to some level, feed people who were against transgender rights, which ironically Bailey is not against, and Blanchard is not against, and I am not against. In fact, all the three of us support the rights of transgender people to self-identify, everyone to self-identify in terms of gender. All three of us have supported funding and insurance systems and public systems for transgender interventions if people feel that that's what they need to be well. But as so often happens in American politics, you're only allowed two positions. So I recognized that by saying that these transgender activists had attacked Bailey in unfair ways, I was going to be positioned as being anti-transgender. What happened was predictable yet still very shocking. This was around 2007, 2008, when Google's algorithms were easier to hack. And the people who came after me were good at hacking those algorithms. In the course of about 72 hours, they completely changed my identity online. I went from being somebody who had been an LGBT rights activist and an advocate for intersex rights to being somebody who wanted to put intersex people in the gas chambers. There were sites set up attacking my parents and my sister, who are conservative Roman Catholics. I'm an atheist sex researcher, but I come from a family of conservative Roman Catholics. One of them was kind of funny because it said that I was a tool of the Catholic Church, and I realized my parents wished I was a tool of the Catholic Church. But I was not, in fact, a tool of the Catholic Church. There were threats made in various venues, and I began to become very worried about my son's safety in particular. He was 7 years old at the time. So my whole identity began to shift, and the people I had worked with in intersex rights were calling me saying, "Do you want us to defend you?" And I kept telling them, I really don't think you should, because that's going to drag the intersex rights movement into this, and I don't think that that should happen. This is irrelevant to the intersex rights movement. And in fact, this is also irrelevant at some level to transgender rights, because what I'm saying is these people made stuff up, not that transgender people shouldn't have all the rights that they are due. So my choice at that point was to give up on my scholarship or to go forward. And I decided to apply for a Guggenheim Fellowship and to ask the Guggenheim Foundation to provide me funding for a year to go out and talk to other researchers to whom similar things had happened. Specifically, researchers who, like me, were progressive individuals doing research, but had turned up research that upset some identity politics activists and who had been beset upon. And it turned out these people were plentiful. I had no idea how many people there were until I put the word out and said, these are the kinds of people I'm looking for, who do you know? And I was flooded with case studies of people who had been through similar kinds of situations. People who had challenged particular disease concepts and were had angered groups that believed that they had a particular disease, that some researcher was questioning whether or not the concept of the disease made sense. In some cases, people who had been attacked for doing research on pedophilia, because just by looking at pedophilia, you're a suspect in a lot of political categories, even though the people who study pedophilia actually do so because they want to help prevent and treat and avoid pedophilic abuse. One of the cases I looked at was the case of Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer's book, A Natural History of Rape, which looked at the biological bases for sexual coercion and sexual assault. They were looking at non-human animals as well as humans, trying to understand what biological components there could be to sexual abuse. And when they published their book, the same thing happened to them as happened to me, as happened to so many other people, which is the idea that there are only two possible stories, and if you don't fit in one, you have to fit in the other. So because Palmer and Thornhill were saying things like, rapists actually do pick off different types of targets. For example, there was data to show that rapists do preferentially rape women of childbearing age compared to women who are, girls who are young and women who are old. They do preferentially pick off women of childbearing age, that they do actually, they are interested in what women wear. This was read as being said, it is a woman's fault if she dresses the wrong way, or it is her fault if she is raped, which is exactly not what they were saying. In fact, when I interviewed Craig Palmer, he told me the story of how he got into this. And he got into this specifically because he was worried about women being harmed by a false narrative about how rape happens. So what had happened was he had been going to graduate school in Arizona and he was studying anthropology, but postmodernism was moving in and he decided to just leave the field because his feeling was, if it's all going to be about whoever's narrative is more oppressed gets to tell the story, what's the point of doing science? So he left and he moved to Maine and became a lobster fisherman. The logical thing to do next in your life if you leave graduate school, by the way. And what happened was he got a call from a prosecutor back in Arizona who was asking him whether or not he knew of any relationship between a girl who had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered and the man who they believed did it. And he was confused as to why this guy was asking him this, and he didn't know of any relationship between them. And it became clear the reason the prosecutor wanted to know this was because the narrative that feminists had legitimately pushed, that rape is about power, not about sex, had gone so far that defense attorneys for rapists were arguing that unless you could prove that the man was in some way interested in taking power over this woman, just saying it was about sex was not going to get a conviction. So this was a very serious situation from Craig's point of view. It was a very well-intended move on the part of feminists and very effective in terms of changing the way rape prosecution happened. It was a good approach. But the approach had gone so far that defense attorneys were taking it and twisting it and saying rape is never about sex, it's always about power, so unless you can prove it's about power, the rape wasn't really a rape. It wasn't about sex. So Craig was so upset by this approach that he wanted to go back and show that rape has a sexual component in order to say, if you can prove that the man raped her and there was a sexual component to it, it's still rape, even if you can't prove some kind of power relationship. So he actually went back to graduate school, paid the bills in lobsters for a while, and ended up doing his work on that and partnering with Randy Thornhill. When the two of them published their book, which is an intense book to read, I have to say, because it's a book that takes a very dry look at a very uncomfortable subject. What ended up happening to them was death threats because of misrepresentations in the media. So the media repeatedly portrayed them as being apologists for rapists, as saying that if it was a biological component that men were not to be convicted because they couldn't be held responsible for biological actions. So they ended up with bomb threats, death threats, having security details, etc. I also ended up looking at what had happened to the case of Napoleon Chagnon, who was a famous cultural anthropologist who had studied the Yanomama people in South America. And he had been falsely accused with his colleague James Neal of having purposely created an epidemic of measles among the Yanomama people to run a eugenics experiment to see who would live and who would die. By the time I came to that story, that had actually been shown to be false. But what I was interested in was why the American Anthropological Association decided to prosecute Chagnon on ethics charges for 2 years when they knew that this was false. And I ended up spending another year on that project, so my Guggenheim year turned into 5 years, although they only funded it for 1. But what I found in that case was that the American Anthropological Association leaders in the ethics investigation knew that the charges against Chagnon were fundamentally false, but the reason they decided to do it was because they thought they would look bad to indigenous populations around the world and to progressive leftists if they didn't prosecute a guy who was a swearing, beer-drinking, sexist guy who went out and studied indigenous populations. So basically they decided to scapegoat him in order to prove their own moral purity. And I ended up with internal memos basically documenting this, which was pretty stunning. So what I was finding over and over again is that there had been this invasion in the progressive left in academia of using ideology to decide what was true and what was false. And this is extremely disturbing to me because as somebody who comes from a family that is a Polish family that suffered under the Soviets, it was very clear to me that this was the kind of thinking that would lead ultimately to the imprisonment of people based on their ideas and not on whether or not they had actually committed any crimes. That this was the beginning of the kinds of regimes that lead to unjust behaviors and false imprisonment and restriction of ideas, restriction of freedom at the most fundamental level. So I ended up taking on all of these projects and beginning to fight actively from the left against the left within academia that is the kind of left that makes decisions based on identity and not actually on real action. And that has been challenging work, to say the least, because of the fact that the progressive left within academia has chosen, in many ways, to see freedom of speech and academic freedom as a cause of the right. And again, I find that deeply disturbing, because we really need to care about these issues as issues that matter to us if we think at all historically about what has happened. I thought I was wrapping up the book at that point, but what ended up happening that took me another few years, the end of that 5-year period, was that I was contacted by my old colleagues in intersex rights in 2009, late 2009, early 2010. And what they told me was that there was something going on that they had been trying to stop, but they hadn't been able to. And this was a case where a major researcher that we all knew, a woman named Maria New, who was then working at the medical school, and still is, at the medical school at Mount Sinai, was giving a group of pregnant women who were at risk of having children with girls, genetic females born with an intersex condition, so with intersex genitals. She was offering them a prenatal treatment, which was a steroid, to try to prevent intersex development in their fetuses. Now, in theory, I don't think there is necessarily a problem with doing that kind of intervention if what it means is that a surgeon won't be coming at you with a knife. But in practice, this was extremely disturbing, because what was going on, and it was really clear as soon as I looked at this that they were right, what was going on was that Dr. New was telling these families that this treatment had been found safe for mother and child, while at the same time she was going to the National Institutes of Health and getting grant funding to find out if it was safe for mother or child. She was using the same population of people she had brought into the clinic, claiming this was safe and effective, gave the mothers while they were pregnant the treatment, and then going to the NIH and saying, let me study these people to find out what really happened to their babies. So they did not know they were experimented upon. And the NIH also didn't know that they didn't know that they were experimented upon. So I tried to blow the whistle on this from the basis of my job at Northwestern, along with, I dragged in first my colleague Ellen Fitter at American University, but then also we pulled in about 30 other academics in bioethics and allied fields. We wrote to the FDA complaining that she was advertising off-label use as safe and effective to pregnant women. A drug, mind you, it's dexamethasone, known to cross the placental barrier and change fetal development. It was explicitly being used because it could cross the placental barrier and change fetal development, claiming it was safe and effective when there was no data to support this. And we also wrote to the Office for Human Research Protections, which is supposed to protect people in NIH studies. And I thought the government would help. I thought that these were why these agencies existed, and that this would be a slam dunk, that they would come in and say, you cannot be doing this to these women. You cannot be misleading them and using them as research subjects essentially without their consent. And that's not at all what happened, and I tell the story in the book of what actually happened. But I will tell you that part of what was going on, it became clear as we dug deeper into this, is that Maria New was explicitly interested not only in trying to prevent intersex development, but she also knew that this particular population of girls had higher rates of growing up to be lesbians and transgender men, and also in childhood they had higher rates of being tomboys. And her research was directed at seeing whether she could use this drug in this population to prevent tomboyism, lesbianism, and transgenderism. So she was using a drug to try to do a social engineering experiment. Well, what ended up happening was that I got into a big fight with the FDA and the OHRP, and they basically were deeply disappointing. I ended up using the Freedom of Information Act for several years and had to sue the government in order to get them to comply with the Freedom of Information Act, and obtained thousands of pages of documents in which I was able to show exactly what I had thought had actually been going on, which was that this population of families did not know that what they were being told was not supported by any scientific evidence, and that in fact they were being used later as research fodder. The only place this drug has been appropriately studied is in Sweden. It's a small study, but the Swedish study basically shows a 7% mental retardation rate among the children exposed. And it shows an 18% severe medical adverse event rate. In other words, about 1 out of 5 kids in that study are severely harmed, it appears, by this intervention, which is not too surprising because it's a strong drug being given as early as week 2 of pregnancy. So why do I tell you that story? Well, I tell you that story because people thought as I did this work that I was going to end up on the side of saying researchers should be able to do whatever they need to do. They should be able to go out in the world and not be harassed by social justice activists. But in fact, if we don't have social justice activists watching what researchers are doing, then it's exactly that kind of stuff that happens. It's that kind of serious violations of people's bodies and rights that occur. And that's why we need social justice movements to remain as a check on research, to make sure that people's rights are in fact protected, because it turns out the government frankly doesn't give a damn and doesn't really help very much when push comes to shove. They are deeply unreliable in terms of help. So what do we have happening now in academia, just to kind of bring it home, and then I hope we can have a lot of discussion this evening. What we have, unfortunately, within a lot of academic systems is what I would call the earnest left, trying hard to stop people from using language and ideas and doing the kinds of research that they consider dangerous or offensive. On the right, we have people like the Koch brothers buying their way into university systems the way historically the left did, and now the right is doing it. We also have at state universities in places like Wisconsin and North Carolina, state legislatures run by the Republicans actively coming in and shutting down programs they don't like. And guess which kinds of programs they don't like? Women's studies programs, gender studies programs, sexuality studies programs, poverty centers, looking at how poverty affects people's lives and how we can prevent poverty. These are the kinds of things that these state legislators are actively shutting down. They're picking off courses they don't like and trying to stop them. And then what we have in the center, or not really political center, but in terms of what I see as a serious danger, is the problem within universities of corporatization. I see less of that in the Wellesley campus than I do at the big universities, but it's coming to all of us. It's this approach where we increasingly have MBAs and not PhDs in control of university systems. People who are chiefly concerned with endowment size and money and brand, and much less concerned with what actually happens in terms of intellectual life and growth. And I can tell you this from my own personal experience at Northwestern University, where I resigned my position. I was finishing up Galileo's Middle Finger in 2015, and this was a book that Northwestern had made possible. Without tenure, on a part-time position, because I'd given up tenure in 2005. I had no tenure. I had a part-time one-year position that was renewed and renewed and renewed and renewed. Northwestern had allowed me to do intersex rights work that had challenged the entire pediatric establishment of intersex care. They had allowed me to tick off the transgender activist community. They had allowed me to fight with the FDA, take down the OHRP in terms of public attention, piss off the medical schools of Mount Sinai and Cornell. But what ultimately caused them to censor me? Well, the administration changed just as my book was getting ready to go to press. And we had a new administration that was very concerned with corporatization and basically creating a deal between the medical school and the hospital corporation that allowed the hospital corporation to take control of a lot of the medical school. And I was in the medical school at Northwestern. What happened was we had a magazine/journal that we published every year out of our program. I was in the medical humanities and bioethics program. We were heavily on the medical humanities side of that. And we published a journal, I called it a topless journal because they were short pieces, but it was a very high gloss, beautiful production about once a year called Atrium. And every year we picked a theme, and we sent out a call for proposals and took back proposals, decided which ones we would work with, went through peer review, edited them, sometimes rejected things that couldn't come up to standards, and published them. And in 2014, I was given the job of being the lead editor on that issue. And the theme that was chosen was the theme of bad girls, which was a theme that I thought was great, and everybody thought was the perfect theme to give me because I was known as a bad girl, and I also am a feminist and somebody who's worked in gender studies and sexuality studies, so it made sense for me to take that theme. Other themes we had done included power, the liminal, graphic, these were humanities themes. And what happened was there was one article that was submitted in proposal form that I really liked, and it was this piece called Head Nurses by William Peace, Bill Peace at Syracuse University, who's a disability studies scholar and a cultural anthropologist. And Bill used his own account to talk about sexuality and disability. When he was born with a neurological condition, and at the age of 18 it caused him to be spinal cord injured from the waist down. So he became paralyzed from the waist down. This was in the 1970s, so it's during the sexual revolution, and he's in a long-term rehabilitation facility, and he wanted to know, would he be able to have sex, could he have children, and none of the doctors wanted to talk with him about this. Here's an 18-year-old kid who wants to talk about sex, and they didn't want to talk about it. So he tells the story about how close relationships developed, because at the time, these were long-term facilities where they were basically like homes that people lived in, and they got to know the nursing staff very well. And he had been told that in some circumstances, some of the nurses developed sexual relationships with some of the patients. And he told the story about how this happened to him one night. He thought he had finally gotten bladder control, which was difficult because of his paralysis, and he ended up losing it and pissing himself in the bed, and he was crying and hit the nurse's call button. So this is not the setup of a Playboy story, believe me. He's pissed himself and he's crying and he hits the nurse's call button. And this nurse that he had become very close to came and reassured him that it was going to be okay, he was going to get control again of his bladder. And she saw that he was kind of playing with himself, and she decided to offer him oral sex. And she gave him oral sex to show him that, in fact, he could have sex and he was going to be able to be a father and it was all going to be okay. And in telling this story, he made clear that he did not think that this is the way rehabilitation hospitals should work. He called this the Wild West of rehabilitation medicine at the time, which it was. It was a crazy time in the 1970s in rehabilitation medicine in some areas. But what he was using this story to ask was the question, have we yet started dealing with the issue of sexuality of people with disabilities? Why do we still deny the fact that people with disabilities want to have rich sex lives in many cases? Well, this was part of a journal that, frankly, I thought I was going to get in trouble for one of the articles on abortion. There was one article on abortion, and I'm pro-choice, but it made me very uncomfortable. But I thought it was a very provocative, very interesting piece written by a woman who is a women's studies scholar and also an OBGYN who does abortions. There was also pieces on transgender life in Samoa. There were pieces on women who birth without medical care. This was all the usual edgy stuff that we would publish. And 3,000 copies went out to the paper subscribers. It went up online, nothing happened. And then I got a call that the dean one night had read this issue of Atrium and had gotten so upset with this article that it might violate a branding agreement that he had made between the medical school and the hospital, and he was ordering it to be censored and taken offline. So he ordered it offline, which happened, and I was told, shut up, don't talk about it, which is hard for me to do, especially since I had a book coming out in academic freedom. But what made it much more repulsive was the fact that he actually went farther than that. He created a new editorial committee for Atrium, which consisted of the PR department and the dean's office, and we were told they would decide what themes we could do, what proposals we could send out, which articles we could accept, and what we could publish. So there was a new editorial committee that would tell us what we could say. And I said, and my colleagues said, this was absolutely intolerable, that we could not live in a situation where the PR department was going to tell us what scholarship was adequate. So I went in and tried fighting the dean's office. My colleague Christy Kirshner did as well. Christy is a rehabilitation medicine physician and also a disability studies scholar, and she had published one of the pieces in the same issue. Hers was on women with disability and their sexuality and the way that they have fought to have real voice in terms of sexuality. Christy ended up resigning before I did, but I resigned a couple months later because I fought and could not get Northwestern to change this repulsive policy where we would be subject to a censorship committee. And the whole experience was rather Orwellian, because as I was fighting with the dean's office, they kept saying to me, I kept saying, you really shouldn't be doing this. I have a major book coming out in academic freedom, and I'm not very good at shutting up. And what they kept telling me was, congratulations on your book, but we get to say what you're allowed to say and something we pay for. And I told them, but you pay for all of the work that I do, and am I supposed to run past you every tweet, every blog, every op-ed that I do? And they would simply not answer the questions. I don't think that my experience with being silenced by the brand is actually unique. I think I was just in a unique position where I could call it out. So I was able to quit because my health insurance comes through my husband's job and not mine. And I was able to quit because that job didn't pay me very much anyway, and most of my money comes from writing and speaking and from doing other kinds of things. And also because I have alligator skin, so I could take quitting. And I had a career on the side as well. But I have heard since from people who have definitely gotten the message through their university systems that if they do anything that is too controversial, that threatens the brand, that the university does not really want them around. What's happening is a blanding. through the branding system, a system whereby people are told, we want you to do high-profile work, but not too dangerous because we don't want to piss off these people or these people or these people or these people, because we have to always maintain the system where the money keeps coming in. And this is a very dangerous situation. We've got the left, the right, and the branding going on. If we can't have a free university system where people are able to think in dangerous ways, teach in ways that are risky, take risks in terms of their research, we're going to have a system where basically the people in power are going to use the people yelling to decide to basically shut down anything that's threatening to anybody. And that is not going to lead us forward. So that is who is going to lose. So how can we think about activism in terms of how to do better activism? Because as you can hear from these stories, I don't want to give up on activism by any means. One thing I would say is if you want to do better activism, sit down and think about what the outcome is you're going for. It needs to be a pretty clear outcome. You can't simply say, I want the world to accept X. If you really want to do effective activism, it is best to actually figure out what X will look like. How will you know you're getting closer to your goal? Try to come up with real markers that you can say to yourself, this is what we're going for. Perhaps a law, perhaps a change in a law, perhaps a recognition of society of a particular issue. What are you going for and how can you measure whether or not you're getting there? That makes your activism more effective because it becomes more focused. Secondly, and I know this sounds paradoxical, I think it's incredibly important now and then as an activist to try to do work that is nonpartisan. To try to step back and do work that is descriptive rather than normative, that simply describes a situation. And the reason this is useful is because it allows you to step back from the ideology that is leading you at the moment in order to see what might I be missing by being very focused on one particular goal. Instead of being focused on the goal, try to see what exists. The other thing that's useful about nonpartisan moments is that you actually often understand better the person you're fighting against, and you can do a much better job engaging them if you can actually understand where they're really coming from and not engage them as a caricature. Try to really figure out. I got much farther along in dealing with doctors who deal with intersex care when I began to really recognize what was motivating them was love, not hate. That what was motivating them was affection for these children, not phobia. And that began to allow me to see why they were doing what they were doing and why they were so passionate about it. And why they were good people and not bad people for the most part. There's a couple of bad people in that group, but not too many. Third, I would say pay attention to relationships. It is very easy to stand outside and protest and yell and scream, and I've certainly done that in my lifetime. But I have to say the most effective social change work I've done is sitting down over a meal with people who I was trying to change and really getting to know them and trying hard for them to see where my argument is coming from. That allowed me to have conversations with them that were respectful and moving forward. You can't always do that with somebody, but when you can do it, it's incredibly useful. Most change does not occur because of noise, it occurs because of relationships. And it's easy to feel oppositional, it's easy to feel righteous. It's more difficult to do the work that actually produces change. And then lastly, what I would say is if you want to do effective activism, think very carefully about the tools you're using and whether those tools in the hand of somebody else could be used against you. And if that is the case, be very wary of using those tools. So if one of the things you want to do, for example, is shut down speech, think about the way that that's going to come back and bite you. If you encourage your university administration to shut down speakers you don't like, when is the next time they're going to shut down a speaker? And maybe it's somebody you really wanted to hear from. Be very cautious about the tools that you're using and try not to use the tools that are going to go into the hands of the masters and be used against you or against anybody in an unjust way. Try to think about the ways that when you engage with people, you're not simply engaging at the most obvious level, but think about, could you engage them at a different level? Could you use different types of tools that are morally tools of higher integrity? I often tell people, at the end of the day, the only person you have to sleep with is yourself. And so it's incredibly important every day to think about whether or not the work that you're doing has integrity. And part of that is recognizing your own inability to see what you're doing, One of the things that has been so incredibly helpful to me about my critics is pointing out blind spots. I talk about that in the book, of being at actually a conference where somebody was criticizing me, and unfortunately I wasn't allowed to speak because I wanted to say to her, that's a really good point, and I hadn't thought about that. I think you're absolutely right in criticizing me on that. Can we open our minds and our hearts in a way that allows us to think about what it is we might be getting wrong? And can you ask yourself the question, what evidence would it take to prove to you that you're wrong? And if there's no answer to that question, then don't pretend you're doing something that's scholarship, because it's not. Scholarship always has the potential to be wrong. That doesn't mean everything in the world has to be scholarship, but I really want to encourage you to think about the ways that academia is kind of sacred, and that it's the one place in the world that we can still have relatively independent thought and inquiry and move us forward. So many of the progress moments we've had in our society have happened specifically because academics have helped us think about how to move forward. Finally, sometimes people call the stuff that I do brave or courageous, and so I've thought a lot about how I don't feel that way. And it's occurred to me that I think what that means is something different. So when a parent rushes into a burning building to save his or her child, nobody calls that brave, that's normal, right? You rush in to save your own child is a perfectly normal reaction. But if a perfect stranger rushes into a building to save your child, that's bravery. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that the person who is the stranger rushing in recognizes that child as their own kin, even though they don't know them. They recognize them as part of their own. And so what it means for us to be brave is to have a wider concept of who is kin to us. And to think about the ways that the scholar in Turkey or the scholar in Iran is our kin and is somebody that we have to care about in order to have bravery and moral integrity. And when we can do that, I think we begin to finally overcome the tribalism that causes us to harm each other. And we begin to reach a moment where we can actually take care of each other. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions and comments and criticisms and anecdotes and jokes. Yes?
Oh, hi. So I just wanted to comment. I don't have any questions.
Sure.
So I just wanted to say, I'm from Poland. I'm an international student. And coming to the US was like I was thinking about the US as the capital of freedom of speech and people respecting each other's opinions. And since I came to US, I realized, at least towards the college, I realized it is really hard to speak out. Sometimes if your opinions are different than somebody else's. For example, I wanted to conduct some research in psychology, and I heard from my professor that actually I shouldn't conduct this research because it's not going to be accepted. So I kind of faced the reality, and I was really sad, and I realized that Poland, which is a post-communist country, has actually more freedom of speech right now than US. And it made me feel very sad about actually coming here. But speakers like you who come to campus make me realize that maybe not the whole US is like that. And maybe not all people are so close-minded and so aggressive towards other opinions. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for saying all of that. And I hope you speak more about that experience and that disjuncture. When I went and I spoke to the Fire Foundation's student networking conference, that's the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. It's the free speech group of academia. I was so surprised to see that 80%, it felt like, of the students there were international. And then I started thinking about it, and it's exactly for the reason you said. They either came from countries that were much more oppressive, and they saw threats to freedom in America that were causing them great concern, or they came from places they thought were more oppressive, and then they discovered it was worse here. And they were very motivated by that disjuncture. So I think that's a very useful thing to speak to a lot in terms of your experience. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I actually have a question related to what you were talking about earlier about the spread of misinformation, making it difficult to understand what your actual views and opinions are. Earlier today, there was an email sent out, I think to everyone in all of the classes, saying that among other views, you believed in forgetting exactly what the phrase was, but like gender conversion therapy. Is that true? And if so, could you explain that? And if not, why would someone attribute that position to you?
What did this person say that gender conversion therapy
Gender
was?
conversion therapy. I think it was defined as using, well, oh, yes, I would. Thank
Sure,
you. The
thank
text of
you.
the actual email.
Great, excellent.
Dreger is a historian of medicine.
True.
Yes, point one for the email. She has done a tremendous amount of research and advocacy on intersex issues that is important and needed. However, the Freedom Project is bringing in Dreger to talk about a controversy she is only tangentially related to. On disproven theory she has done no actual scientific research on. I don't think this is the part I was talking about. Here we go. Furthermore, Dreger has written in support of gender conversion therapy, which has been condemned by many transgender individuals allies in the World Professional Organization for Transgender Health, which writes, quote, treatment aimed at trying to change a person's gender identity and expression to become more congruent with the sex assigned at birth has been attempted in the past without success, particularly in the long term. Such treatment is no longer considered ethical, with a bunch of in-text citations.
But they didn't have a section just after it about anonymity.
Sure, but that's the section that I was asking about.
Sure. So historically
You can ask about the
speaking,
next section if you want.
some of you may know, historically speaking, medical doctors attempted to stop people from being gay and lesbian, and they used various kinds of therapies to try to prevent this. And some of them were quite intense, things like transplantation of testes from cadavers into gay men to try to make them more masculine. Some of it was recommendation of heavy bicycling to try to straighten out gay men. For lesbian women and gay men, they were subject to shock therapies, to lots of things. And by the way, a lot of these studies claimed that it worked. That in fact it stopped people from feeling gay and lesbian and made them straight. And you can imagine if you were in that study, you might say whatever you needed to do to get out of these studies. What we know today is that the research we have most currently appears to indicate that you cannot change somebody's sexual orientation. Related to this was work done in terms of gender issues. And the reason these two things got conflated together is because a lot of people who grow up to be gay and lesbian present as being gender different as children. And what was going on was that doctors recognized that if a boy acted in relatively feminine ways and had more historically feminine interests and feminine toy choices and feminine social behaviors, that they might grow up to be a gay man. And so one of the things that was attempted with kids in that population was an attempt to stop them from being gender different because of the idea that this would prevent them from growing up to be gay or lesbian or transgender. Those did appear not to have worked, and instead to have led to people having a lot of psychological problems because of the ways that they were shamed in those systems. What this person appears to be talking about is talking about kids today who present as either gender different or uncomfortable with their genders. And this has increased. The number has increased dramatically in terms of our population. And that's probably largely because we're allowing children to explore gender identities in a way we have rarely allowed them in the past to do. And some of those kids get identified by their parents as needing a doctor. I actually don't think in most cases kids in this situation need a doctor because there's nothing wrong with playing with gender. There's nothing wrong with feeling that your gender is more complicated than historically you would have expected to have. But some of the kids end up in gender clinics. And what happens in these gender clinics varies all the way from people who feel that as soon as a child has any questions about their gender, that's evidence they're probably going to end up as transgender, and so you should send them down a route of puberty blockers, etc., to people who feel that that is way too fast an approach. I would tend to go with where the data goes, and that is to suggest that children at a young age who have these kinds of issues showing up are very unpredictable in terms of their outcome. If this stuff shows up later, then it's more likely that a child will end up identifying as transgender. And so what I get accused of is saying that that I think that you should try to force children to feel the gender that matches their sex at birth. In fact, I have argued and believe that what you should do is try to retain an open future for all children in terms of their bodily integrity so that they can decide for themselves, hopefully at a relatively mature age. They can decide what to do with their bodies, what to do with their reproductive health, what to do with their sexual function. But that gets categorized somehow as not accepting transgenderism. In fact, gender identity is much more complicated than sexual orientation, although sexual orientation is turning out to be more complicated than we gave that credit for too. But gender identity is actually really complicated, and we don't understand it well. And there's reason to believe that different cues given at different times can probably affect the way that we see our gender. We know historically that different cultural situations change how we see our gender. So I actually see the whole scene as actually being really quite complicated, and that the best you can do for these families and these kids is to try to have an approach that is a realistic approach, which is to say, we actually don't know where this is going to go, and so what's the best we can do in terms of allowing you to have space to do the exploration you need to do? Does that mean sometimes kids will go on puberty blockers to prevent a puberty that might be unhelpful? Absolutely. That said, I do wish that we had better studies of those puberty blockers, and we're only just now finally seeing clinicians beginning to study the puberty blockers so that we can have better informed consent. At what age should people be allowed to decide whether or not to change their sexual function? I think that depends on the child in terms of you should work with social workers and psychologists to try to understand at what age the child is mature enough to be making a decision that they're going to be comfortable with. Because you want a situation where they really own that decision. That's the decision they're going to have to live with primarily. So it's really important that they be empowered. And I would say the same thing with intersex kids, that they need to be empowered as much as possible.
So that email got your views of it wrong, is it fair to say?
Well, I think it depends how you define all of the parts. But yeah, I would say that's kind of wrong. And there are blogs out there that are, again, in my name with my photograph saying all sorts of things that I actually don't believe. Yeah.
So I've spoken to a number of the members of the Wellesley community who have been concerned at your presence in this talk, and something that came up time and time again was the notion you mentioned of
Gynephilia.
Yeah, autogynephilia, thank you. And you talked a little bit about how your defense, your personal defense of Blanchard and I forget the name of the
Bailey.
Thank you, Blanchard and Bailey. I knew it started with a B. You were defending them on a personal level because of the personal attacks that you experienced as a result of writing those articles. But I'm also curious because it seems to me in the research that you did that you also supported the theory of autogynephilia. And from what I've heard, it's been a really hazardous theory in terms of propagating harmful stereotypes about the trans community and trans individuals. And I know you mentioned that sometimes theories you support or the things you say go to support causes that you aren't aligned with.
Right.
But given that you see yourself as an ally of trans individuals, I was wondering if you could talk about how your support of this theory has become involved with maybe the propagation of these harmful stereotypes and how that could be reconciled with being an ally, because to me, I mean, at least without taking responsibility for that, even if it wasn't intentional, it could be hard to really align yourself in that way.
Yeah, so historically speaking, the clinicians in charge of who was allowed to transition, who was not allowed to transition, had strong what is called gatekeeping. The clinicians got to decide. And fortunately, that's changed to a large degree. But one of the things that they had as a policy in some places, like Johns Hopkins University, which not coincidentally was also a place where there was a lot of problematic stuff going on with intersex, one of the policies they had is if you were a person who was socially identified as a man who was seeking to transition legally and physically and socially to be a woman, if you were going to end up as a straight woman, that is to say you were attracted to men and you could pass as a woman very convincingly, they were okay with that. But if you were going to end up transitioning and appearing to be, for example, a lesbian woman who perhaps didn't pass as well, that was not acceptable and they would not allow you to transition. And one of the ways that got framed was that was just a sexual fetish, whereas the other thing was somehow a legitimate sexual orientation. One of the things Blanchard and Bailey tried to do is to say, no, these are all legitimate sexual orientations, and that in fact, there's nothing wrong with these motivations varying in terms of who transitions. That should not determine who gets to transition. That said, it is certainly possible, and it is the case that some people who are very anti-trans rights look at these kinds of things and say, see, it's just a sexual fetish. But that's actually not what Blanchard and Bailey say. What they say is, no, it's an orientation. And if it's an orientation that is best served for that person by transitioning, and she is empowered to understand the choices she's making, we should totally support that and give her the tools that she needs, including insurance funding, to make sure that she can get the transition that she needs to do well. One of the things you don't hear about is the people who openly identify as autogynephilic, and the reason you don't hear from them is because as soon as you do that, you're attacked by a lot of people as being a traitor, essentially, to the transgender community. So when you drill down into these issues, they are really complicated, and it is certainly the case that you can have this kind of stuff misused by people who are interested in restricting the rights of transgender people. I mean, I've ended up arguing with people like Paul McHugh at Johns Hopkins University for his views. He says that one of his claims, he's a conservative who does not believe that transition is a good idea. He says providing transition to a person who is transgender is like giving an anorexic liposuction. And this is the most ridiculous analogy I've ever heard, because anorexia is a disease that is obviously going to be significantly made worse by liposuction. And what we know, actually from the work of people like Blanchard, is that allowing people access to transition, if they're reasonably well screened and they are confident that that's what they want, that they do better. So that's one of the reasons that I think of transgender as interventions as being legitimate medical interventions, because if we look at the before and after in terms of how people are doing, if you provide them adequate care, they do better. And that's why, to me, it should be funded, and it should not be viewed as merely cosmetic, because merely cosmetic suggests it has no functional purpose, when in fact people do better. And it's interesting that the work of people like Anne Lawrence, who self-identifies as an autogynephilic transgender woman, and people like Ray Blanchard, who's considered, the enemy of the people, they've actually bothered to do the research showing people do better if you give them access to transition interventions. So it's not the case that there's this simple sort of pro and con, pro and anti. You can actually believe in what Blanchard found and what a lot of studies have demonstrated and a lot of personal narrative support, and be absolutely pro-transgender rights. It doesn't break down so simply. Yeah.
In an article by Professor Julia Sorano, she says that there is a body of evidence from different scholars, Barnes, Johnson, Rogarden, Serrano, and Winzen, that disproves the autogynephilia theory, and that you have said allegedly from this article. You have posted answers to some question about gynephilia, and this Professor Julia Sorano, says that you haven't answered to those specific claims that disprove this theory. Is that true? If so, what was the deal? And why are people concerned that there might be a bias in that sense?
Yeah, I think, I've tried to answer a lot of what she's done, and she kind of says, what about this, what about this, what about this? And to be frank, I don't think that that's the best use of my time. I think the people who want to argue endlessly about the evidence for autogynephilia, the best people to do that are the clinicians and the scientists and the people who are critiquing them. And I've frankly did not spend the rest of my life doing that argument. So
what was flawed about their arguments in your opinion?
Some of what's going on is disagreements about which parts of people's narratives to pay attention to, and that's a really challenging thing to do when you're doing histories of people where the histories are tied up with so much heavy politics in terms of what people have been told to say, allowed to say. And I'm not just talking about by the actors, I'm talking about by the clinicians, teaching people what they are and are not allowed to think about themselves, which historically has happened in terms of transgender care. And unfortunately, I think to some degree still continues to happen in terms of people getting clear messages about the way they're allowed to think about their own histories. So I think part of it is in terms of what the focus is that people look at. And then we're trying to collect more evidence to understand different kinds of brain patterns. But I am personally skeptical that the way we should go is to look into people's brains and say, oh, this person is really transgender, but this person is not really. Because my feeling is, I don't really care what your brain tissue looks like. I want to hear from you what you need from the world. And that is, to me, where we should be operating. So you know, I'm mildly interested as somebody interested in science in terms of these brain studies, but at the end of the day, I have no interest in having these brain studies tell us who's allowed to get access to transition. Because it seems to me, well, you know, I would quote what one wonderful guardian of an intersex kid said to me when the doctors were trying to transition this kid against his will. They were trying to feminize this child who had announced himself as clearly being a boy. He was born with intersex genitals. And they wanted to do yet another blood test to try to figure out exactly which intersex condition this kid had, blah, blah, blah. And this very wise woman, who was the guardian of this child, said to me, I don't need another blood test to tell me who this kid is. He's told us very clearly who he is. He has announced he's a boy and marched into the boys' room. Why would we cut off his penis, right? And that, to me, is exactly the way we should think about the issue of gender identity is, we can do brain scans on people, we can do genetic tests, we can do all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I want to hear from you, how can I best respect you in terms of your self-identity?
Just a short follow-up question. So I read the article by this professor and I wanted to make sure that the issue with the evidence was not an issue. But how do you then interpret when these professors, this person holds a PhD, come so viscerally almost to these matters? I see the issue from both sides, and I'm myself trying to learn and trying to understand how to bridge a situation where our emotion, ourselves, our identities, our histories, our past are so intertwined with how we want the future to be and how we interact with other people. So how do you interpret this problem or this situation, and how can we do a better job at recognizing it for ourselves and maybe communicating with each other? So if you were to face this person, if you were to have a conversation with this person, what would it look like? How could that disparity be bridged?
I'm not sure it can be bridged, because I think at some level there's a somewhat strong disconnect in terms of what we think of as being the way to think about narratives, and again where the focus is in terms of thinking about who gets to say what and which counts as truth. When you're dealing with human lives and deep histories, it's very hard to simply conclude which one is the thing we focus on or the thing that we believe. But what I would say, I was talking to a faculty member here earlier, and she was asking me, what are you working on now? And I said, you know, I think I've been in the same position as you, as struggling with these kinds of concepts on lots of different controversies. And there comes a point in your life when you develop enough self-doubt that you feel like you no longer know at all what to do. And that's kind of why I'm doing local investigative journalism at the moment, because I feel like I know how to look up a city ordinance and figure out who covered up what and maybe what should be told in terms of the truth to the people, and I can handle that. But at this point, I think it can be very difficult, after studying so many of these things, to have anything other than a sort of lot of self-doubt about how we know what is true in the world. And you're just getting there earlier than I got there in terms of that level of self-doubt. I think it's a sign of intellectual health, but it's very disabling. Yes?
Hi, so actually, I'm just reading an Isaac Asimov story that correlates perfectly with what you were talking about. Is about professors at universities who were forced into specific, like, specializations, and if they strayed, they were accused of intellectual anarchy, which I kind of like. And I'm thinking, as I'm a person who's really into science, and I want to, eventually probably go into academia and research. I was wondering if you had any advice to all of us, kind of as students, navigating this academic world so fraught with different, corporate interests and political interests. Like, what's the best way that we can do research that's beneficial and accurate when, from all sides, we're being bombarded with people that are trying to sway us in different directions that benefit their own agenda?
So one of the ways to try to correct for bias and skewed thinking is to work with lots of people. So we're supposed to be doing that in academia in terms of vigorously discussing and contesting and critiquing. Unfortunately, what's happened in a lot of academia is kind of building those silos, and people don't want to cross-talk and argue. So what I would say is that you have to maintain a value of argumentation and of debate and of criticism, and not see that as a negative thing. And it's strange to me that we've ended up in a situation in academia where we see conflict as a bad thing. We're supposed to have conflict of ideas, and we're supposed to have conflict of viewpoints, because that can be very productive. If we all agree with the same thing, we don't need a university. That's just a textbook that's dead. That's not a university that's vigorous. So your attitude is the right attitude, right? How am I going to think about where bias is coming from? How am I going to think about where this stuff is coming from? One of the things that would be great if we could achieve it, but we haven't achieved it, is if we could take all this money that people want to give us and put it into a blind trust so that we didn't know where the money was coming from and who got whose money. And at some level, that used to be more like the way the academy was, where money was not so clearly sent from so-and-so to so-and-so, but where it came into universities, or it came in through the NIH and the NEH, and then filtered down, and allowed us to have more independence from the funding sources. But that's something that's going to be increasingly difficult to do, because understandably, people who want to dump tens of thousands or millions of dollars into university systems want to have influence. That's why they're doing it. They don't want to randomly give universities large checks without some influence. Historically, again, the left has done that and done so very effectively.
First, I just wanted to make a quick clarification, then I'll get to my actual question. So you believe that, orthogonophilia exists, but you don't believe that it is the reason behind the majority of trans people transitioning?
It's one of the ways that one can experience transgender. Mm-hmm.
And then these were just a couple of quick points that I had. One, you said on a few occasions the idea of feminine behaviours. Do you not think that society's influence on the role of gender norms is playing into that a bit? I'm not saying that there aren't people who are trans, I'm saying instead that the idea that people should be one or should be the other and can't be intersex and should act in a certain way as a predictor of that is a bit destructive. I was also going to say, you said that academia is the one place for independent thought, but I don't think that's true. I think anyone can reason with anything if they truly want to grapple it wholly, and I think academia can be as much of a flaw as that as it can be a power depending on how people use it. And I was also going to ask really quickly about, you said at the beginning that there's an influence in who universities choose as their speaker based on their funding. So with that in mind, what reason would they have for choosing you as the speaker?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just answered the last one, and that's that Tom told me that he invited me because he read my book, and he said, oh my God, you've been through so much in terms of trying to fight for the ability to do both social justice work that is not subject to oppression and also do research that is not subject to oppression, that he felt he could strongly identify with the kinds of struggles that I've been through. But part of what motivated him was my resignation from Northwestern, that he felt that it was very scary that a university would actively censor work, and that he felt that it was showed a lot of integrity that I stood up and resigned very publicly over that censorship. So that's what he told me.
So I'm an environmental studies major, and the bane of my existence is people taking the work that I want to do and misrepresenting it and sensationalizing it and basically saying that I'm saying the world is going to end or it's definitely not going to end depending on where the money's flowing. And what that has come down to in a lot of environmental studies papers is that in the discussion session we will explicitly state what our findings do not represent, what they cannot be interpreted as and what they should not be interpreted as, to avoid those kind of sensationalizations and to kind of cover our own bases. Now, based off of what I've read about you and the things that you've said tonight, it seems to me that a lot of the frustration from the trans community is about the fact that people who are transphobic can use the words that you are saying and take them out of context to a large degree of what you believe that they mean and make some rather hateful points. Do you think that there is any merit in perhaps doing something similar to the environmental studies field and saying exactly what your points are when you say these ideas, or do you think that that's not necessary?
I think it's great that you do that kind of statement at the end, and it doesn't protect you.
Oh, it doesn't, but it
absolutely doesn't.
If they quickly try to say that I'm saying something I'm not, I can say it's stated.
Yeah, and there have been cases where my work has been misused, and I've contacted people and say that's a misuse of my work, and they, generally ignore me. But actually, my work has not been misused that much. My work has been represented as potentially doing that, but it hasn't really done that. I think because frankly, people who would be inclined to misuse my work in that way in the service of being anti-transgender rights knows I'll come and kick their asses, and I do. So like Paul McHugh, I've gone after in the press as being somebody who I think is illogical, unscientific, and repressive. So they don't need me, frankly. They've got plenty of people on the nasty side that they can use, and they do use the people on the nasty side.
So the last question, please.
Yes. Before this talk tonight, I read your Wired article about potential problems with banning gender conversion therapy in Canada. I was wondering why you believed that banning harmful gender conversion therapy would necessarily lead to the complete opposite reaction of every non-gender conforming kid being forced into being transgender. Why do you think that's the logical outcome of that situation?
What that law originally said before it was revised and passed was that it was going to stop people from allowing children to basically question their genders in terms of if they expressed anything, you were not supposed to question that. And that to me strikes me as very harmful. So I think it is really important that physicians, especially pediatricians, be allowed, if a child raises an issue, to explore that issue and to go ahead and ask, is it possible that you're feeling that way because of this? Or is it possible that the best way to deal with this is to this? So for example, if you had a child who was born female and declared herself male, and the reason that she was giving you is that she felt this way was because she wanted to grow up to do a male typical profession, like she wanted to grow up to do construction work, or she wanted to grow up and marry women. Is it not unreasonable to say to her, well, you should be aware that girls can grow up to be construction workers and girls can grow up to love and to marry women, that that's okay. You can do that and still be a girl. That is the kind of thing that was being outlawed, was the possibility of doing that kind of exploration. And that to me struck me as extremely dangerous in terms of assuming all sorts of things about these children that we should not be assuming. That in fact exploration with them is a good thing. And if that was interpreted as being questioning their gender identity, I don't think so. I think in many cases what that meant was actually respecting the child's ability to explore and to grow and to be open to possibilities. That the messages they've been getting about what makes a real girl or a real boy are overly simplistic. And there's possibilities that maybe life is more complicated than that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. I just want to add that when you make a sophisticated, nuanced argument, there can be always who can take bits and pieces of it to spin it into something else. But that should not be the way you're understood. So thank you so much again. Yeah.